So today we have a wonderful panel, and we're looking at the question, to believe or not to believe. That is indeed a question that has been at the forefront of religious discussion and thought for millennia. Today we have three, dare I say, distinguished members of our faith community who will share their views on the three main streams of thought regarding this primordial question: does God exist? Our three panelists will each speak for 6 minutes, and yes, I have a large hook, after which we will have talk back. So you can tell us what you think and ask them questions. So be sure to jot down your questions. I'd now like to introduce our distinguished panelists, who I actually do hold in high regard, despite my remarks earlier. Jim Stephenson is a man of many accomplishments. He has a PhD from Stanford, was a successful IT entrepreneur and consultant, a Green Party candidate in 2 elections, the president of this church, and perhaps most relevant to today's proceedings, he co-led a number of Freethinkers forums with John Biasucci. Paul Jaffe is a rare bird, a lawyer with a sense of humor. I know, it's hard to believe. When he's not poring over arcane legal tomes, he stimulates his right brain by playing brilliant jazz piano, and is often to be seen up here with the NSUC band. When I asked him to participate on this panel and informed him there would be a hook after 6 minutes, he immediately fired back. When I say immediately, I like within a minute of my sending an email. I'd be happy to participate, but I'm a little hurt that you think I need a hook. If I believed in God, I'm convinced she would strike you down for that comment. Mind you, I don't disbelieve either, so maybe she will. Judith Gordon is a gifted teacher who teaches ESL and the nuances of Canadian culture to wealthy Chinese students to finance her true passions in life: independence, travel, and her master's level studies at the Vancouver School of Theology. Judith loves hiking, snowshoeing, and debating the finer points of religious principles and beliefs, making her ideal for this panel.
Good morning. I was born in a Catholic hospital in Paris, Texas, baptized in a Methodist church, attended Sunday school in a Presbyterian church, confirmed and married in a Lutheran church, and then I ended up here. My parents told me from the start that Santa Claus was imaginary. They didn't want my belief in Jesus' miracles or resurrection to be shaken when I learned the truth about Santa. Today, I don't believe in Santa or the miracles. I appreciate Jesus' teaching in parables, but I don't believe the miracles occurred. My disillusionment came when I learned that other people believed in other miracles, other prophets, and other gods. And which beliefs people had depended almost entirely on what their parents believed. It was cultural and familial, not truth. And what different people believed conflicted. They couldn't all be right. Who was right? Or maybe they were all wrong. This launched my own independent search for the truth. I realized that I had more faith in the discoveries of science than in the 2,000-year-old stories in sacred books. And does God exist? Well, the answer is that I don't know. As Woody Allen says, there's no way to prove there is no God. You just have to take it on faith. Richard Dawkins observes that technically he's an agnostic. On a scale of 7, where 1 means he knows God exists, and 7 he knows God doesn't, Dawkins calls himself a 6.9, stating, that doesn't mean I'm absolutely confident that I absolutely know, because I don't. As an economist and engineer, instead of a scale of 7, I like to use subjective probability to express my degree of belief. I'm about 95% certain there is no supreme intelligence. And I'm about 99.9% certain there is no heaven or hell. Not 100%. Technically, I'm an agnostic. But I may someday wake up to find that I'm in one place or the other. See you there. I also don't believe in a creator. I think there's about an 80% chance that the creation of the universe was a random event consistent with science. Although I accept that science can be pretty weird. And I don't believe that human experience is affected by divine intervention. Why do bad things happen to good people? Because they were unlucky. The lifetime chance of dying in a car accident is 1 in 77. If you are one of the 1 or 2 people here today who will die in this way, it won't be because you are a bad person or because God doesn't like you. It won't be part of God's plan. It will be because you were unlucky. What are the consequences of my lack of belief? Do I behave badly? Do I have no experience of wonder and awe? Not at all. I find that I am hopelessly good for nothing. Despite not believing that I'm being watched by a divine being who will eventually punish me, I find that I really want to do the right thing. I can't help trying to practice honesty, fidelity, compassion, and generosity. I'm sorry, there's no good reason for it. As for wonder and awe, I experience that whenever I contemplate nature, beauty, music, evolution, consciousness, other weird science, birth, conception, laughter, anger, or a sunny day. So what do I want and not want in a shared worship service? I want music, inspirational words, wonder and awe, and a sense of community. I prefer not to hear references to God because it's such an ambiguous term and because many of the meanings have negative connotations for me. Does the speaker mean the jealous, angry God of the Old Testament, the loving, omniscient, and omnipotent God of the New Testament, the Creator, or the scientific version of Mother Nature? Every time I hear the word, I spend the next 5 minutes thinking about which definition is meant and what that means. More precise language is appreciated. And what about prayer? As much as some people argue that it doesn't necessarily mean talking to God, that's the meaning that comes up for me. When we come to the prayer, meditation, or contemplation section of the service, are we praying to God? It's not meditation as usually defined. At its best, it's a shared statement of aspirations. And as we state our aspirations, I prefer the seemingly French words, may we. I'd rather hear, may we be compassionate and forgiving, than help us to be compassionate and forgiving. The non-petitionary may we form calls upon us to achieve, rather than asking for divine intervention. And I had problems with today's prayer. But I don't want the services to be devoid of the spirituality which feeds the soul of other worshipers. There is a great unknown. There is a great unknown. Science hasn't figured everything out. Not yet. I don't mind references to all that is, the unknowable, or even something greater than ourselves. But I'd also appreciate the occasional mention of the awe of scientific wonderment. For me, that's spirituality. I want an inclusive service that meets the needs of different people and doesn't needlessly offend or exclude. And I want us to continue sharing what our needs are, what we believe, why we believe, and why we sometimes feel offended or excluded.
Now, I'd be the last one to suggest there is some sort of conspiracy between Mark Pezarro and Jim Stephenson to put me in second place here. Nor would I suggest for a nanosecond that the title of today's sermon has left me out. Mark told me I was the eloquent agnostic. But to believe or not to believe is an interesting debate amongst theists and atheists, but it really doesn't directly relate to an agnostic. Jim himself, of course, rightly points out that some of the world's most famous atheists are agnostic. Atheism is a spectrum of belief. At the one end, you have those who strongly believe there's a God, At the other end, there are those who strongly believe there isn't. But the notion of an agnostic exists on a scale of knowledge. So there's the belief system, and then there's the knowledge system. And pretty well everybody's an agnostic. Because even Jim says that he's a fan of science, and he prefers to think of the universe and of the meaning in life in terms of science. And he says, and this is where I do part company with him a little bit, science hasn't figured out everything yet. But I think we know that it never will. It never will. And that's the interesting thing about... well, let me explain through a funny little story what I'm trying to talk about. The agnostic goes camping with the atheist and the theist, and they find a beautiful little campsite. It's a marvelous summer night. They set up the tent, get their sleeping bags inside, then they sit around the fire and they talk about the meaning of life and all these fabulous things. Finally, it's bedtime. They go to sleep. At 3 a.m, the agnostic wakes up his partners and says, "What do you see? What do you see?" The atheist says, "Well, I see a universe that evolved from this moment of singularity, the Big Bang Theory, expanding and billions of stars, all explainable through the combustion of hydrogen and helium on these massive celestial bodies." The theist says, "I see a magnificent, indescribable display of the heavens that only intelligent design could create." And the agnostic says, "No, you idiot, somebody stole our tent." And you see, because we're looking at different things. And so I think that, first of all, the subject before us today, what could be more Unitarian than to exchange views on something which in many parts of the world would get us in a lot of trouble? Isn't it wonderful to live in a place where we can do this and where we have the freedom to do this? And I think much of what Jim had to say isn't so much questioning the existence of God, because really, let's face it, it's definitional. Are we talking about a judgmental figure with a list of rules that watches us and decides our eternal fate? Or are we talking about something that's mysterious, like Einstein would talk about God as being an explanation for that which science can never determine? I think that's what Judith's view is going to be in a minute, is that her God that she will discuss is that greater, bigger, mystical thing, rather than a judgmental person who goes on the basis of rules and some scripture to judge us. Because it's the latter approach which I think has given God a bad name. I think religions have done God a lot of harm. If one accepts that God can be a term applied to that which we can never understand, I think organized religions have done a great disservice. I'm a big fan of science too. I was raised in a house with both parents being physicians and in the science field. I grew up, I wish I had more than 6 minutes to tell you some of the funny stories and things that I would find in our fridge. But let me just say this. It doesn't really matter what you believe, as long as you accept that whatever you believe isn't going to take you to any sort of degree of certainty. To say God made the universe inevitably raises the question, well, what made God? How did that happen? To say that the Big Bang is the creation of the universe inevitably leads to the question, well, what caused that? What happened to that? Whether you pursue a scientific approach or a theist approach, you end up at the same place. How did that happen? How did that happen? And I find that the more I study science and try to understand it, the more I'm taken in both directions. The Hubble, a deep field. It can look off into out into the universe. It can detect light sources 14 billion light years from the planet Earth. And and can't go further because there hasn't been enough time since the universe was created for light to be further out than that. But in 1/27 millionth of space through the Hubble, they find 5,000 galaxies, each of which have over 100 billion stars in them each. That's in 1/27 millionth of space. Now, does that take you closer to God, or does that take you away from God? I don't know. It takes me in both ways. Here's another thing that just again creates this great divide within myself.
At the risk of being struck down.
I told you there was a conspiracy going on. All right. Well, look, I'll just say this. There are things we study in science which permit scientists to explain something on the basis of molecular or chemical or other scientific means. But it's simply words put to a process which can be observed and measured, but doesn't explain it. And I've got some examples, and it'll take me way more to see. The monarch butterfly, I don't know if anyone has studied that. But they have now determined that they get to the same patch in Mexico through electrical impulses in their antennas and a connection with their eye, and they use a solar orientation. But the cloudy days don't affect them. And the fact that the sun moves from east to west doesn't affect them. They have a navigation system which scientists call DNA hardwired. Okay, it's kind of like our salmon, kind of like the honeybee that does a little bee dance and on a two-dimensional surface can communicate a three-dimensional message as to where the flowers are. The scientists can study it till they're blue in the face. They'll never reach the promised land because all they can do is describe their observations, but how it happens remains a mystery. And I'll just leave you with this one little ironic, well, my God, I haven't started here, and here I am getting the hook. You know you're in trouble when the piano player is asked to speak. Anyway, so in my view, we're all agnostics, and the fact that you may not have known it proves my point. There we go. Thank you.
I awake in the morning and sunlight floods through my window. I listen to birds chirping outside, and I am filled with a profound feeling of gratitude. But to what or whom, may I ask, or may you ask, am I grateful? I've been asked to speak today as one who espouses a theistic view. But first, let's take a look at the word theist. A theist is a person who believes in a God who made the world and who governs. In other words, this entity interacts with we human beings. One can pray or worship this entity. Then we could look at the word deist. A deist is an individual who believes that the world was created, but this creator does not participate in the governance of the earth. The naming issue is exceedingly complex. Wayne Dyer says, let's call it the source. And perhaps we should borrow from Star Wars and call it the Force. To me, it does not matter at all. However we define the word, cosmology and geography greatly impacts our beliefs. Throughout history, humans have had a myriad of belief systems. If we were, well, we would not be, but 500 years ago, we would not be embarking on this conversation. It would be a non-issue. At the same time, as Paul mentioned, in different parts of the world, this conversation could not take place. So what are the determinants of our beliefs? Surely they are factors beyond our control and our comprehension. Now, what about the role of science? Is our existence on this earth mere happenstance? Or is there a creative force that has brought us to this point? To paraphrase Einstein, our knowledge is that of school children. Yes, scientific knowledge will expand, but we will never know the true nature of the universe or our existence. And thus we have belief. I'm going to tell you a couple of stories from my littered history. When I was a young school teacher, I built a cabin on Haida Gwaii, on North Beach. One day I was sawing logs with a chainsaw, and the hoodie which I was wearing, the string got caught in the motor, wrapped around, and the chainsaw jerked up within centimeters of my face, to the great horror of the delivery person who was dropping off supplies. It took me a couple of moments to realize what had happened. And then a feeling came over me, reverberating through my body. It's as if I were being told, that was close, but your time is not up. A couple of years later, I was in Israel on an outing with volunteers from Kibbutz Chatzerim. We were walking through a wadi, and I looked up, and some of the young soldiers had scaled the cliff. The cliff is sedimentary. It is like this. But they're such show-offs. I thought, I can do it. So up I go. I get halfway up the cliff, and I look down, and I see my fellow volunteers. From my vantage point, they appeared as ants. I looked up. There the soldiers were at the top. And I said, this could be the end, but I would really appreciate some help. Well, I made it to the top. Do not ask me how, for which I am very grateful. We will never know the reasons for our beliefs. Beliefs impacted by our experiences, and as I said, our geography and chronology. Of course, I cannot speak for anyone else in this room, but I believe in a force which is beyond human experience. And fortunately, as Unitarians, we have the opportunity to believe as we wish.
So I need more information about the definition of the atheist, because from what I've heard, from my belief, I'm a little bit of everybody. Where does that put me?
Okay, so Alice's question, thank you, Alice, is she would like to hear a little bit more about the definition of atheism, because from what she heard...
Agnostic.
Oh, agnostic, sorry. Agnosticism, because from what she heard, she actually finds that she has a foot in all three camps, which is a little uncomfortable because she's only got 2 feet.
Let me just say I appreciate your implied suggestion that I was the most effective speaker. This should detract from the gratitude we must at least formally express to my worthy opponent. Well, actually, to answer your question, and I come to you with a mind brilliantly uncluttered with knowledge, unlike my friends who are well-read in this area. But the one bit of reading I did do, agnostic is a word that comes from the Greek a. When we put a in front of something, it means not. And gnostic means knowledge. So agnostic just technically means without knowledge. And it's normally used in the context of religious discussions, but it can apply to anything. For instance, you can be agnostic as to whether O.J. Simpson is guilty of murder. And that's not a good example, of course, because everybody knows. But the word agnostic can be used in the context of anything. It's and the fact that you feel as you do, which is you feel a little bit of everything. You can feel tugs going. Keep bearing in mind, you can be an agnostic and a full-blown atheist at the same time, like Dawkins and Hitchens and some of these other well-read folks. So one certainly doesn't exclude the other. You can be an agnostic and lean either way on the theistic spectrum and be quite comfortable with it.
Thank you.
Just remember that he's a lawyer, he's trained to argue both sides of the argument. I have to tell you, we had a meeting at the Cafe d'Argiano in the village on Thursday to discuss this panel. I was laughing so hard that one of the other patrons asked me to tone it down. So. Anyone else? Yes. Please come forward and speak to the microphone so everyone can hear you.
I have another question for Paul. I want to know what was in your fridge.
I don't, at the risk of having you turn down lunch afterwards. My mother was a research doctor at the Banting Institute in Toronto. Frederick Banting, of course, discovered insulin, and Charles Best was. And it's funny how little we know of Canadian history and the accomplishments that Canadians have made in the scientific field. But there's and my father was a forensic pathologist who had a marvelous career at the crime lab in Toronto. And back before this thing called the Human Tissues Gift Act, which prohibited the removal of organs without people's consent, my father had the tendency of supplying my mother with various things. So when we went to the fridge for a snack, we had to be a little bit careful as to what it was we were putting on our toast.
Which explains Paul's work personality.
Paul, the point about the question taking you back to either a religious or an atheist position was really very true for me. And the question that comes to mind is, and this is for any of you, do you think, is there a scientific explanation for a belief in God among those who do?
Okay, so we're going to start with Jim and then Judith, and then Paul will have the last word.
Well, a lot of our behavior is the result of billions of years of evolution, and so scientists are more and more looking at what possible advantages of particular behaviors might have given us an evolutionary advantage. And so there are a number of hypotheses there that are being explored, so there's that. Then on a more simplistic plane is that there's a tendency to interpret unusual events, to put a meaning on those. And so when you put a meaning on random events, that is one definition of superstition and how they get started. And one of the things that statisticians are frequently reminding us of is that distributions, like the bell curve, do have tails. That normal activity, normal possibilities, normal statistics include very unusual and seem remarkable events. And so we should be careful when we try to attach meaning to some of those strange things.
I have very little to say on this topic because a scientific understanding of God is an oxymoron to me.
I would call him God and moron. It's a very good No, but I think the question is a fascinating one, and it's one that can never be answered. And unless you define God in ways that don't make sense. So if you define God as a judgmental figure that observes us on the basis of a set of rules and makes decisions about where we're headed, most people, I think, can dismiss much of that story and say there is a conflict really between that kind of God and science. But if you accept God in the way Judith described God, as just that which is felt and which is a mysterious energy that's beyond any capability for science to ever measure, you won't at that point ever have the conflict between science and God. To me, they fit together quite well. It's the labels that get us in some trouble sometimes. But I don't have a problem with accepting the fact that as science makes inroads, religions tend to yield to science, dark ages at a time when Galileo and Copernicus and all these guys were being persecuted for saying what has now become common, and religions have had to yield to that. So there's a continuing over the ages tension between science and religions. Bearing in mind, there's a difference between God and religions. Religions is the institutionalizing of the theme in various ways. But if we step back from the nuttiness of various religions and look at the bigger question, and if we accept the kind of God that Judith has described, her feeling about it, I don't really see a conflict there.
I don't have a question. I just wanted to give my definition of being an agnostic. It's a case of hedging my bets.
So, have my back to me, I apologize.
Camera's there, so
Okay, all right. So recently, a couple of friends and I had this conversation where we don't really know where we fit in this panel, because we absolutely don't believe in luck. We think luck is opportunity, preparation, meeting opportunity. And we don't believe that God that we love would put these tragedies on these beautiful people. So with those two different, stances within our own selves, where do you fit in? Where do you stand, and are we part of that panel?
Well, while I would agree that you can prepare yourself to have better consequences than you might otherwise, so you can prepare or help your luck. Saying you don't believe in luck doesn't mean that there aren't, in my mind, does not mean that there aren't random occurrences, and we just know that the world has many random occurrences. So many people out of 1,000 with a particular type of cancer, and sure enough, that many do. And which people they are, it will depend to some extent on diet and exercise and things like that. But when you come right down to it, some people are, quote, luckier than others. So to me, luck is just an interaction between your experience and random occurrences, random events. Which doesn't mean that you can't do things that will change your life a little bit. So to me, that these are these random occurrences, and the residual explanation on why it happens, bad things happen to some people and others, to me is just what I would describe as luck.
These are the great questions. Is luck a component of life? I believe it is. In fact, as all my students are exceedingly wealthy, and we know that China is not full of exceedingly wealthy individuals, I inform them of their great fortune being born into the families to which they are born. Is luck a part of my life? Well, I just told you two stories, and we could say the Great Spirit or the Force intervened, or I was lucky. Either one works as far as I'm concerned. Of course, I don't have the standard belief of God, and I even gave a litany of words that we could use in place of that. But surely, and I am a theological student who has just finished all my studies for my master's, I can't conceive of any entity that is evil and out to get us.
Luck, the concept of luck refers to an outcome based on a series of individual events. So if you break down that bit of history which led you to that state where you say, I was lucky, each component of that was not a function of anything in particular. You started the power saw. That's not a matter of luck. You put the power saw on the log. That's not a matter of luck. You put your head too close to it. That was dumb. But you see, when you take luck and reduce it to its component parts, it's all quite understandable. And you can call luck fate. You can call it divine intervention, you can call it anything else. And Judith felt something special that had somehow given her that message. And that's cool. And to me, if you can believe in God and it makes your life better, go for it. If you want to believe in science and that the pursuit of science is ultimately going to take us to answer these big questions, awesome. That's to me, you've got to choose what's most comfortable for yourself. That's the whole purpose of this exercise. And keep asking. There's this. I think it's endemic to us as a species to be asking these questions and to be searching for the truth. That's a funny little saying. Somebody quote him. I used to believe in God, and then I began asking questions about life the Bible couldn't answer. What a way to spend your 10th birthday.
So here's my question. It seems like a lot of the discussion around what we believe is rooted in a non-belief of archaic cultural norms and ideas which have very little to do with now. So if we were to put aside completely, if you were to put aside any reaction to the old religions, any of the old religions, what is it in the Word, God, Spirit, energy, force that you would seek, that you do seek, that you perhaps have in your life, that you would put the name to? This is sacred and precious.
All right, once again, I'll ask all three speakers to respond, if they choose.
Well, I think that, I described that I seem to have this compulsion to be good for nothing. And I think there seems to be some things that bring me joy and seem to make the world a better place. And I think that is what I seek out in some extent called to. So I think that would be it. And it's some form of goodness, and it may be have an evolutionary reason, but I feel that, and I feel called to it.
I appreciate Alison's comment about ridding ourselves of ancient beliefs, sometimes not so ancient beliefs, and dealing with how we feel here and now. And then I concur with Jim. It's a sense of goodness. We know what is right, and it's a fulfilling experience to pursue that.
Yeah, I think what is sacred, I think, was Alison's question, and we can feel it in different ways for different people. There's something very deep and meaningful that transcends any holy book or anything that's been sort of institutionalized as a rule. It's much more inner, or and I can't. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to subject you to a terrible little story here. I don't know what sort of challenges Michael Jackson had as an individual, whether these pajama parties were as innocent as he asserted them to be. But I can tell you that when he was being interviewed by Larry King, and Larry King, which, let me tell you as a lawyer, you don't have your client go on national TV being interviewed. That is a starting point, but leaving that aside. Larry King leans forward and says, "Michael, what were you thinking to have those kids at your house?" And Michael leans forward and looks him in the eye. He says, "Larry, when I look into the eyes of a child, I see God." And boy, did that ever resonate with me. And I in my professional life, I live in a serious and stressful, rather toxic world. But I'm a hockey coach and a soccer coach and a baseball coach. And when I get out in there with those kids who are still living in the moment and have that beautiful innocence, I know there's something happening here. And I'm so thankful that I can be part of it. It's so deep, and so whatever that is, to me, is sacred.
Alison, thank you for that wonderful concluding question, and Al for those moving answers, and thank you all of you for your your questions and participation, and please join me in expressing our appreciation to the panel.